Towns in late 15th century England. The first thing to note is that in stark contrast to today, England was an overwhelmingly rural country. We can't talk then about the man in the street, it has to be the man in the field. Nevertheless, there were towns. Perhaps they contained overall about 10% of the population, we can't be sure, as opposed to 80% of a much bigger population today. And there were four broad categories of towns. Number one was London, which was in a class of its own. 60 to 70,000 people, which was immense by contemporary standards. Nothing touched it. Then you had, say, a dozen provincial centres, like York and Norwich, which might be 12 to 20,000 people. So there's a big drop. Number three, you had towns who had perhaps 4 to 10,000 people. Oxford would come into that category. After that, you had towns with below 4,000, and which were called simple towns. They weren't usually chartered boroughs, i.e. recognised as self-governing by the king, but they were local market centres, and their population might even be under 1,000. So they'd appear to us just like a village. But nevertheless, to the local population, they would have the functions of a town. These figures seem tiny to us, but multiply the urban population by present-day ratios. If you take the population of a 15th century town as a percentage of the total English population of the day, then they're not so small. Let us take Norwich, and let's say Norwich had 12,000 people. Well, multiply it by a factor of 15, and we get, say, 160, 180,000 people in present-day terms. That would be the present-day percentage for Norwich against our global population. Well, what were the functions of these towns, of even the smallest towns? What differentiated them from a village? Well, in some degree, what towns did bore a strong resemblance to what towns do today, except they did less of it. The range of functions of today was probably not quite there, but the functions they did have we would recognise of today. Marketing and services for even the smallest towns. In that rural economy, a town or a settlement might be recognised as a town because the weekly livestock and produce market was held there. That meant that shops, where the travelling fairground people or permanent shopkeepers would be there, so country people could buy all sorts of craft-made objects, hammers, sickles, all sorts of things, a range of goods which they couldn't get in their villages, or they could barter from them. Services also. The elite might consult a lawyer in the local town, just as you do today, and there were a higher range of clergymen, and probably better educated clergymen, to hear your confessions. There were specialist functions for larger towns. Many towns were, of course, centres of cathedrals, for cathedral towns like Winchester, Gloucester, Lincoln, Norwich itself, and other towns had military functions like Dover, which had a royal castle, and Dover, of course, was a port, and by no means the only one. Exeter, Hull, just as today. Trade was important. Shrewsbury is interesting. It was sort of inland port on the Severn, because Shrewsbury in Shropshire, because wool was brought down and traded from the Welsh mountains at Shrewsbury, and then the merchants would buy it and send it on to London. In that society, another feature of towns which has now escaped us, we don't notice, is the sheer concentration of population, even if it was only 1,000 people, much more so if it was 12,000 or more. Concentration of people into 100 acres or more was very unusual. It's a stark contrast with the normal dispersion of people over an endless countryside. If you want real unspoiled countryside, go to medieval England. In the countryside there was manufacturing, the wool manufacturing, weaving particularly, but that also happened in towns. There was a complaint that in the 15th century that manufacturing was escaping the control of the town councils and guilds and their taxes and restrictions and moving out into the countryside. You might say Thatcherism before the letter, free, unfettered industrial production. But nevertheless, some making of products, gloves in Oxford, for example, went on. But the wholesaling, even if goods were made in the countryside, they were brought into the towns to be sold. Wholesale merchants were based in towns. That was definitely an urban function. I've just mentioned Shrewsbury in this regard. There were various factors in 15th century England making for A, prosperity, B, decline. 15th century England was not overwhelmingly a prosperous time for English towns. One factor making for decline was common to the whole of the country. The plague, the Black Death, general unhealthy conditions meant that people had died in England as in the rest of Western Europe, but the plague tended to be worse in towns because people were concentrated together, as I've said, in insanitary traditions. In this depressed situation, the guilds, the trade organisations, were often said to have a restrictive function. A, they limited the amount of trade that could be done. B, guildsmen themselves often resented the burden of office holding. A prominent guild merchant or craftsman had to serve on the town council, and that meant there were few town council expenses in those days. That meant that he had to spend his own money. However, there were also religious guilds, and this is an important function of towns. The guilds' mystery plays, the confraternities. If you wanted an elaborate religious festival, if you wanted an elaborate array of religious services, you'd find them in the town rather than among the usually very poorly uneducated rural parish priest of a village who wasn't often not much better educated than the peasants he served. The towns and their guild organisations, their town councils, tried to promote an organic cohesiveness. The towns spawned a middle class, as you might expect, of lawyers, priests, shopkeepers, merchants, which was almost totally absent from the countryside, whether you either had gentry or peasantry. And they endowed churches. By the 15th century, they were patrons of schools. The earliest English grammar schools tend to date from the 15th century. They were, with the advent of the printing press, the literate urban middle class were one of the biggest markets for books, both religious and secular. The poems of the 14th century, poet Chaucer, were printed by Caxton in the late 1470s and received a wide sale, and we think it's the urban middle classes who start to buy it. A special word for London, or rather the twin cities of London and Westminster, were so huge that it was certainly a special case. Everything went on in London. The royal court was there, abbeys and churches of all sorts, but two main cathedrals, Westminster and St. Paul. The Parliament was held there, of course. The City of London had its own privileges. It was almost like an independent urban republic, headed by its Lord Mayor, and it contained the greatest concentration of rich merchants in Britain who lent money to the king. The legend of Dick Whittington, the poor boy who becomes Mayor of London, in the 1390s, Dick Whittington actually existed, with or without his cat. Although he wasn't that poor, he was the son of a Gloucestershire knight. London was also the greatest port in the country, as it remained until very recently. And it was, as it remains, a national focus for the elite. You not only went there on business, but it was the only place in Britain that you could have a really big range of urban pleasures, and the only place in Britain where you could enjoy yourself without exciting gossip. If you went to your local town, even to Norwich, and had a high old time, it would probably get back to, say, your mother or your mother-in-law in the manor house in the village where you actually lived most of the time. So it's not surprising that around 1500 the Scottish poet Barbour, the Scottish towns were very small, wrote a poem to praise London, saying, "London, thou art the flower of cities all." London, in fact, had a dominating position which it doesn't really have these days, where, of course, over the last 200 years, Many other towns, not as big as London, but rather big cities, have also grown up in Britain: Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow in Scotland. So, urban life was important in the 15th century, but it seems a child, or rather undeveloped overall, compared with what we have been used to, really, for the last 150 years.